All right, good to be with you guys. Many of you know me as Dave Putthoff, Great Commission Heartland Region. Oh, it's been with you guys many, many years now. They asked us to introduce ourselves, and I can do that now in decades. The last decade plus, it's been with Frank and Tony and Joe, known as the Cowboy Biker Church. We fought that for a while. We were reaching out to anybody, but mainly just looking to reach outsiders. And around Kansas City, there was a real strong cowboy culture. Bikers, same way. They got their iron horses. They see themselves as outsiders to church. So we gave up fighting it, though. After a while, we became known as the Cowboy Biker Church of the Great Commission. That's cool. We live with that. So past decade's been that. Past 2 decades before that was in the suburbs around Kansas City, Lee Summit, with Tim Honeycutt and Doug Brown. Wonderful years there. A lot of church growth going on there. 10 years before that was more micro-church stuff with Great Commission. Started out on the university campus. I came to Christ at Rockhurst University. Not because of Rockhurst. I was studying there, studying business. That's a university in Kansas City. Right next to University of Missouri, Kansas City, UMKC. And there's the Art Institute there. We have a church there now called The Rising. I'll be speaking there next Sunday. And so we still have a campus work there. I came to Christ and came to meet some guys on a campus. Was reaching out pretty aggressively at Rockhurst and UMKC and was being recruited by Campus Crusade and the Navigators. Then I ran into this group called Cornerstone. And Cornerstone still exists as a community church. They moved over on the Kansas side, part of the Heartland region. But I ran into some folks there. One of them is Clint Hall. Anybody remember Clint? Back from the old days. I see some hands up. He said to greet you all. He's getting remarried. Some of you know Val had passed away some years ago, and he's going to be getting married here in a month or so. So he said to greet you all. And this was a group that didn't just talk about the Great Commission. They were living it. And they were doing everything they read in Scriptures, as opposed to my experience. We have roots with Crusade, right? Navigators and all that's great. But this group called Cornerstone got my attention because they were doing church. They were being the church. And some of what I want to share today relates to getting back to some of those primal roots of being the church, right? It's not about going to church. We don't go to church. We be the church. And so that's part of my story. Also, I really just want to set the stage for Robbie. Tonight, he's going to be speaking on the Great Commission, going to exegete some stuff. And so I'm going to set the table for you, brother. This is kind of a bridge talk, victim to victor, bridging from what Brent shared from Habakkuk and the seasons, tough seasons, and the opportunity for us to re-examine some things. I'm going to overlay the Great Commission onto that. What can we learn about the Great Commission when we run into tough times? Many of you have been asking about this. Some of you I'd walk by and you say you didn't even recognize me. Well, the story is there. One of Frank's episodes, this was probably the time before last where I was actually outside of his emergency room. I get a little choked up even thinking about it. How brave he is. It was one of those situations in the emergency room where it was very critical, a huge blood clot they were dealing with, and I was in there just for a little bit, and in comes this doctor and medical guy who looked like he could handle himself. You know what I'm saying? And he was going to take on this emergency and get something done. Well, I stepped out and pulled the curtain, and the anguish from Frank's voice to this day, I'll never forget that. I hope he outlives me. Maybe together we'll see Jesus come back, right? But regardless, hey, we'll press on, do the things of the kingdom until Jesus comes back. But about that time, I had kind of committed to myself. I don't know if I even shared this with Frank. I thought if he ever lost his hair with chemo or whatever, I was going to shave my head. And this last time he was going through it in Mexico, got very critical. It was a time he almost died down there. It's been several times like that. He did die. So he passed, so they had to bring him back. Hearing some of that, I kind of prepared myself. And every spring I usually get a shorter cut anyway. So I just decided, I got this shorter. I got a boy that just graduated, 20-year-old, one of my kids, from sergeant school up in Nebraska. I've got a daughter in Alaska right now, one getting ready to go to Guatemala as a missionary, and then my son Dawson, my baby, he just graduated from sergeant school as a 20-year-old. He's on the fast track. He spent a year in Qatar, was deployed at 19. And so he's a leader type, and they've seen that and recognized it and have invited him to maybe consider special forces and some stuff. Don't know where that'll lead. But anyway, so come spring, I got this military cut, where it was really just skin. And everybody was saluting me. That wasn't quite what I was looking for. So I went into the barbershop and said, "Give me the Stone Cold Steve Austin." And this is what I walked out with. So I'm kind of enjoying it. It's cool. I better get my notes open here and get going. So that's enough introduction. Been a part of what we call the Heartland region officially, formally, since 2010. Did regional stuff before that out at Lee Summit Community Church. We had a marriage conference that was a regional thing. My wife and I organized for 22 years while we were there, and then we moved on to rural. So my experience, I want to thank this association of churches for the many opportunities they've given me. I've been a part of a church plant at a university campus, then in a suburb that grew into a megachurch, then out to the rural areas, and we're the largest evangelical presence in Lone Jack, that's our town. Been a part of movement church stuff since then, some underground things. I mean, you name it, I've tried it, working. All of that has led to an opportunity in Kansas City where I've united with some guys that think about city reaching. And so we're even talking about, what does Metropolitan Church look like? What does it look like if we were to ask the question, how can we reach every man, woman, and child in a metropolitan city the size of Kansas City? What would that look like? What would we need to do differently to really make an impact like that? Gospel saturation kind of strategery. And so I've learned a lot through that, worked with multiple churches. We just started an initiative called Saturate KC, where we're real pressing heavily into Bible engagement across the city, united with the American Bible Society and Biblica and some others. We're doing some things with missional prayer. We've united with a group, another one I'm a part of called What If the Church, and each year we do a theme. This year we did What If the Church Loves KC, and we rolled out a strategy where we invited churches across Kansas City to unite together, even share pulpits. And we had about 47 churches do that this year. About 20,000 neighborhoods adopted in missional prayer. Some really amazing results coming out of that. So we're getting some momentum with some city reaching stuff. So if any of you want to dialogue and talk on that, I would love it. That's not going to be within the scope of my talk today. But some of my learnings have come from that. But I owe Great Commission churches for all of my experience. And so I've been a part of micro to mega to multi-site to movement churches and now metropolitan kind of city reaching stuff. And I don't know if you guys do much in your cities like that where you unite with other churches, but if you've got experience like that, people listen. I get invited to these kind of things across Kansas City. It's usually maybe 50 pastors here, 30 pastors there, gatherings where we get together, ones that really want to get serious about what is it going to take to reach an entire city. And much of my platform comes as a result of the experience that I've gotten in this family, in this tribe. And I'm very proud to tell people that. And so that's been really great. Some of this thinking, some of my new thinking that even pushed me toward gospel saturation was some years back, my own story of victim to victor. That was, ministry, we're just going through a time where ministry was just kicking my butt. But it's in those times that God can really speak to us, right? Just like Frank pointed out with his story, he has never been hearing the voice of Jesus more clearly. And if we will allow that, God will speak to us and bring clarity that we've never experienced, and that's been my experience too. Now, I can go the other way. You can get bitter. You can get bitter or better. It's our choice. And so we've asked this question, what to do when life sends us back to the drawing board? This is a good place to be. We've got to remind ourselves, at the drawing board, I think it's where God does his best work. Now, it's out of pain. I'm going to be referring toward the end of this message to a story in 1 Samuel 22, the cave of Adullam. I've found in experience in talking to different ones, especially ones that are into kind of movement thinking, they've been through a cave of Adullam kind of experience and come out of it thinking kingdom. And so we'll get there. I don't want to get ahead of myself. And so in setting the stage for Robbie tonight, you know what? What I've learned, one of these is, this is a key point that's kind of driven my life a little bit. It takes leadership at a regional level. We as an association, we're big enough where you need directors. But if you want kingdom movement, you need missiologists. And I want to tell you that Robbie's one of the best in our movement. So come tonight and hear what he's got to tell. We need to think missiologically. We need to think apostolically. I think if we're continue to be on the move, to be spokes in a moving wheel, as Frank said. So going back to the drawing board sometimes can be the best place for us. I've had opportunity to sit down with pastors across Kansas City and even in our movement here and there over coffee, ones that are going through a challenging time where they're back at the drawing board and they're reevaluating some things. There's one fellow that all of you would know that was a part of our movement sometime back. I happened to be in his city. I won't mention his name. But we sat down and he had actually, I don't want to tell the story because I don't have time, but I spoke before you guys a few years ago. I don't know if you recall, my topic was apostolic movements and missional leadership. Well, I said some things that caused the National Leadership Council to get involved. But after some of that, after banting things around and a few edits, John and David Hoppler put together this video and stuck it on YouTube. Well, it got over 2,000 views. I don't know what it's up to now, but the last time I looked, it was well over 2,000 views, which just opened up. For some reason, it was spreading across Kansas City, and I'd be getting these invitations. Well, one of these guys who used to be in national leadership with our association had viewed it. And when I ended up in his city, we got together for coffee and started to sketch out. You know how you get together and you start sketching things out on a napkin? This is an actual picture of that. I took a picture of this a couple years ago just to remind me to get back to him in terms of some accountability to remember what we talked about. But this was one of our napkins. I was actually staying at the Staybridge Suites right there at the top. And so I was just sharing with him some of my findings in terms of city reaching and movement thinking. And at the time, this was unpublished information, but it's now out there. Lifeway and others have published statistics that 80% of churches in the United States, we're talking evangelical churches, and this is somewhat true of Great Commission churches as well, 80% are either in decline or plateau. That's pretty grim. But that's a reality we're living with in our culture. About 16% are adding, they're growing, but most of that is by transfer growth, adding folks from the 80% that are in decline and plateau. Because the conversion growth rate there is only 1 to 3%. And then we've got about 4% of churches, that's why the circles are getting smaller here, represent reproducing churches, and that's a loose use of the term. That includes multi-site, anything that looks like reproduction is included in those stats. And interestingly, only half of those are on purpose. So 2% intentionally reproduce, the other 2% are church splits and stuff, resultants of reproduction. And then the smallest little circle, 0.5%, are multiplying, actually multiplying. And when I got to this point, as we were just drawing things out and talking, this individual, just his eyes lit up. And he's now a part of a mega multi-site church as big as any in our movement and actually has some national recognition. If I told you the name of the church, you might recognize it. But his eyes lit up when we started talking about multiplication. And we got to talking about the good old days. And he had a picture, I think it was on his phone. I can't recall if he pulled it out of his wallet or his phone. But it was a picture of him in college lined up with 4 other guys. And he was part of a generational picture of someone that discipled someone, made a disciple, he made a disciple, and then 4th generation made a disciple, and he was in that lineup. And he was so proud to show that. And I was thrilled to look at it. But then it brought me to a place where I said, well, if you could do it all over again, what would you do differently? Would you do something differently? And of course he said yes. And then I asked this question, then why aren't you? And it got real quiet. And there was this pregnant pause. And you could see the wheels were turning. He was getting kind of emotional. I just told him, I don't remember if I used this illustration exactly, but I just said, man, you got to get the eye of the tiger back. Because he said he's part of this growing mega church, multi-site. But he said, the guys I'm teamed up with, they just don't get it. They don't really get the Great Commission. They don't really get multiplication. And that's not uncommon. And that's why we've got so few actually multiplying. And we've got great stories in this movement. That's another thing we bring to the table. We've got generational growth to talk about. Now, it's slowed down, but I think we can pick it back up. We've got a firm foundation for some real multiplication movement. And that excites me. But we had this conversation over coffee saying, man, you got to get the eye of the tiger back. I was reminded this week of the scene in Rocky. I think it's Rocky 3. Apollo Creed takes Rocky after he's been famous, got a lot of money, they're in suits and ties. Apollo Creed takes him back to his old gym. And that's where he says, you got to get the eye of the tiger back. You got to get the edge back. And he went on to say, and the only way to get it back is to go back to the beginning. There's some truth in that. I think we can learn from going back to our primal roots as a movement. But how about we go all the way back to the New Testament? We do. That's our motto. New Testament Christianity in action today. That's our driving force. That's really where we need to go back to, right? In Matthew 16, you know the story there? Jesus says, I say to you that you are a rock, and upon this rock I will build my church. You know, he was just calling him Peter. He said Peter means rock. So he could have been saying, Rocky, hey, you're Rocky. Get the eye of the tiger. Upon this rock, and of course he's talking about the declaration that Peter makes. Well, let me just look at it. Matthew 16. And when Jesus came to the disciples of Caesarea Philippi, he began asking the disciples, saying, who do people say that I am? And some said, you're John the Baptist, others Elijah, Jeremiah, others say they're prophets. But then Jesus looks at him and says, who do you say that I am? Peter answers, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered to him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, for my Father who is in heaven did. And I also say to you that you, Rocky, and upon this rock I will build my church. We often get that backward in our thinking. I know the church growth movement was very instrumental and, in a good way, very influential in our movement. But there is a dark side, and sometimes we can get too pragmatic where we think it's our job to build the church. But according to this, who's building the church? Jesus, right? And he not only said he's building the church, he's very personal about it. He says, I will build my church. I think if we're going to have cultures of multiplication, we got to use different language than, hey, how many people are in your church? Hey, you know, my church has this program. It's not our church. It's Jesus' church. And so I think as part of setting culture, let's remind ourselves, Jesus will build his church. He said it's my church. Very personal to Jesus. And then here's the eye of the tiger statement. The gates of Hades will not prevail against it. And you guys have preached on this. You know, gates, the demon said, let's get the gates and throw them at the Christians, No, the gates are defensive. And so we're on the offensive, right? And the gates will not prevail against us. That's the good news that we need to remind ourselves of. Go back to the beginning. The interesting thing here is that this is the first time I'm aware of in Matthew that Jesus uses the word ecclesia, however you like to pronounce it, for church. Up to this point, he's been talking a lot about the kingdom. Kingdom this, kingdom that. I think over 80 times in the Synoptic Gospels, kingdom, kingdom, kingdom. Jesus is obsessed with the kingdom. But here, he brings ecclesia into that context. And so he goes on to tell Peter, this will give you the eye of the tiger. I will give you the keys to the kingdom. Now, I don't have time to unpack that. There may be different views on what that is. But whatever it is, it's a good thing. And so I say, for those of us that are maybe in situations, maybe we're even seeing growth, but we're not really seeing multiplication. We're not seeing generational growth. Disciples making disciples that make disciples. that make disciples. It's time we get the eye of the tiger back. So when we face Jesus, he ain't going to ask how many butts sat in our seats. Now, he might ask how many disciples made disciples that made disciples. And you all know math. We're not going to reach the world through addition anyway, are we? It's going to take multiplication to get the job done. And it's interesting, though, there's this magnetic pull. Even churches that begin to experience reproduction or true multiplication, there's this magnetic pull back to addition thinking. I don't know what it is, but it's our American church culture. We've got a culture pushing against us, but we've also got a church culture that pushes against multiplication, and some of that is the reason why there's this magnetic pull back to addition thinking. Upton Sinclair, he was a 20th century journalist and author, he said this: "It remains an exceedingly difficult thing to get people to understand something when their salary depends on them not understanding it." And I found that multiplication, movement kind of thinking is one of those areas. It really is. We have this view of church in our minds. And I think it's helpful to remind ourselves, what would church look like if we had a medical condition like Frank and we ended up dead and they brought us back and our mind was just wiped of any experience of church? And somebody walked into the emergency room after we kind of, got our bearings and said, "Hey, go do church, and this is all you got to work with." I have a hunch that it would look a lot different than what we're doing now. And I think it's a good question to ask. And it's certainly when it comes to functionality. Sometimes we'll preach on stuff like this, but functionally, is it happening? Is there anything there that we can see that looks like we're actually doing it? Of course, we can point to some things, but are we satisfied with it? And I think sometimes not only understanding, but once that comes, functionality is hindered sometimes by our paycheck. When you get money involved, it just kind of corrupts things. It really does. We're humans. And it impacts our courage if our bottom line paycheck's going to be involved. It really does. And so sometimes our convictions, we pull back, and we just got to not do that. Sometimes we fall in love with our systems. And if that happens, we lose the capacity to change it. It's hard for us if we're kind of guardians of old paradigms, as good as they may be. If God wants us to re-examine some things, if we are at a place of, with a marker board that's all clear, clean slate, what would you do kind of thinking? What would that look like? That's necessary objectivity that sometimes gets missed when we assess things in a church environment or an organization. And sometimes we can't really see clear of our own role in it. And so that's where a plurality, of course, comes into play and helps us out. Some of my thinking lately has been in going back and envisioning what does New Testament Christianity in action today, what does it really look like? I think we should always be reforming back to that. And part of that is just admitting the centrality of Christ, right? That's who we go back to. He brings His commission with Him. And then if we build our ecclesiology, so often we start with our ecclesiology, how we do church becomes our starting point. That's wrong. That ends us up in wrong spots. Start with Jesus and His mission and let us form missional community and church around that. Well, lately I've been, through much of the years, I have to admit, with working with you guys and what we've done in the Heartland region, out of one church there at UMKC Cornerstone, there's been over 20 churches that have been planted out of our region. Now, that means just churches that we have invested in heavily, sent a key leader out, sent the money to get things started. It includes international stuff as well. But that's pretty encouraging. But I think we can do better. Things have slowed down. We've looked at some brutal facts at our last regional. People coming to Christ has slowed down. People sharing their faith has slowed down. Baptisms have slowed down. The percentages the last couple of years are going in the wrong direction. Now, attendance is steady. But again, is that the measuring stick? Butts in the seat? So I've been thinking about this. I mean, over the years, I've been tempted to think in prototype. What can we figure out that can replicate easily? And, there's some healthy things that come out of that. There's different groups that use that kind of strategy. But lately, I've been thinking it's more of an archetype thinking than it is prototype. Let me share what I mean. I looked up the difference. An archetype is an ideal example or a theoretical perfect form. Something that can correctly be labeled both prototype and archetype, but generally prototypes are inferior to the final product. Their very label of prototype implies that it will be replaced with a different form later in the design process. And so as we grow, we should be thinking of design process, getting to better methods, etc. Sometimes that involves complexity, and that's not necessarily bad. But I think if we think in terms of ecclesial minimums, sometimes that we can get to the form of church that can replicate, that can reproduce, and give us something to work with. But even more importantly, an archetype, let me put it this way. The church growth movement brought a lot of thinking that was positive and I think helpful to our movement. That was much more organizational. It was more about efficiency and excellence. And those things are not negative, but they tend to be prototype thinking as opposed to, say, more of an arts ethos where you think about beauty and you think about not something that just would replicate, but that it'll just knock your socks off, inspire you. That's more archetype thinking. Are you tracking with me? And so it brings passion and inspiration to the table to think about it that way. And in my case, it's brought me to some risk-taking, trying some things. I even came to a place where I said, all right, I've been studying movements for years now, several years, and there's a lot to study internationally. Different places you can go, and you can actually go and see movement. I mean, you can see what it looks like, tastes like, feels like. We come back here to the U.S. and lacks inspiration. But it's gotten me to a place where I said, no, if I were to make something, I think here's what's happening. There is a lot of cultural shifts going on that have something to do with that as well. There are less people actually apt to go to church. When we started Lee Summit Community Church, and there were some marketing approaches that we used back in the late 80s that, hey, they worked. They wouldn't work today. But back then, I remember reaching out in the Lee Summit community and inviting evangelism all the time. And it was about a 50-50 shot somebody would come. If you invited them, you built some relational connection, they'd eventually show up. Those days are gone, fellas. They are gone. And the growing, at least in my research in Kansas City, I'm sure it's true here in Minnesota and other major cities like this, there's a growing exponential part of culture. They aren't going to come to our best Sunday, no matter what. They just aren't coming. And so we've got to think more about taking the gospel, planting the gospel. That's what we did at Open Range. We didn't take what worked in the suburbs, take it out to the rural areas, and plant a worship service. No, we didn't do that. We went out and planted the gospel in fertile ground, and a church grew up out of it. God birthed it. God birthed Lee Summit Community Church, I'm sure. God birthed the church I was part of, is one of the Invasion 85 churches, still exists today in a suburb of Washington, D.C. God birthed those. Now, Invasion 85, I thought it was heroic, but it was a lesson. Although we did a lot of things that God didn't birth. They didn't last. Very few of those churches exist today. Tim Herring's is one of them, right? But, so it was a heroic effort, but we've learned some things, right? We've learned to look to see God birth something. That's key. He'll build His church and He'll birth it. And so plant the gospel. Don't plant worship services. I'm done with that. Now, I get it. We need, I'll come back around to that if I have time. But I think what I've learned is that it's essential in movement thinking for us to lower the bar of our ecclesiology, how we view church, but we need to raise the bar of disciple making and what it means to be a disciple. And so, if I'm going to go around churches in Kansas City and promote these kind of things and try to unite churches around movement thinking, I better be living it myself. And so I decided I was going to let God birth it, going to let it be organic. But I'd been praying for my neighborhood. I thought, I'm going to see God birth a church without a worship gathering, without salaries, without inviting anybody to anything, without a building, and see if it can happen in the United States. And that was about 6 months ago, and I've got a bunch of 20-somethings, and some. It's been pretty effective with nuns and duns. The duns, there's been some 50-year-olds, one's my age, that are done with church. I mean, they're just done with the organizational, the machine, they call it. Well, the nuns, they don't have any basis for even what church is, so you got kind of a clean slate there. And God's given me some growth out of the harvest right in my own house. And it started with a friend of my son. My son was deployed to Qatar, and one of his friends felt impressed, but he was a believer already, but he wasn't really hardcore in any sense of disciple making. I mean, he was evangelistic, but he had sweated for about 4 months until he got up the courage to ask me to mentor him. So I saw that, kind of person of peace thinking. I said, oh, sure. We started getting together for coffee. And out of that relationship, ones have come to Christ, been baptized. No bringing to church buildings. No talk of salaries. No talk of hiring pastors. And it's growing. And it's birthed other situations in the city. So I'm looking at some kind of underground church stuff. But it was mainly just to prove it can happen. It can happen. We can be movemental based on this right here. When did they start having buildings, right? About 300 AD. So that kind of thinking, I think it's healthy. Lower the bar of our ecclesiology, what it means to do church. Don't think in terms of going to a church building, all that. It's being the church. And raising the bar of what it means to be a disciple. With this group, I mean, we've been hardcore. Ones have already not lasted with us because we are starting with Christ at the center and His mission, and we're going to build community around that. And guys don't last long if that's not what they're about. I'm cool with that. Let's just see what happens. And so we call it commissional communitas. That's just my way of talking about what we're doing. It's certainly Christ at the center. That's where we keep coming back to. And He brings His mission to us. The commission. The missional, it's gotten overused. So I use the word commissional because it points out what the mission is. We know what the mission is. It's the Great Commission. One mission. I love to talk to you international guys who use the word missions. Where in the Bible is it where the plural? You got more than one mission than we do? No, it's all the same mission. Commissional communitas. Communitas is just a deeper. Community's kind of gotten watered down. Community this, community that. Communitas is a band of brothers that have gone through some form of liminality together, and they've been out in the front forces. And I've got relationships in this room that were birthed decades ago because of communitas, because we were on the front lines together, making disciples and make disciples. You don't have that, so we'll come back around to that as well. I'm going to keep moving on. Part of where we've come to is just owning lostness. Push back on darkness. That's part of the scenario too. So to be a part of this commissional communitas, we got to view ourselves as lights going into darkness. And in Kansas City, there's parts of the city like Lee Summit, sexy part of town, real economically solid. I have seen so many church planters come and go in Lee Summit. I could probably name 20. And there's been many more. Those are just ones that I know about that have come and gone. Because it's a nice place to plant a church. If you think of church as, hey, we're going to get a building, facility, we're going to hire a preacher and get a music guy and maybe a children's director, and then we're going to start a worship service. Well, if you think like that, Lee Summit would be a place to go. But there are parts of town that you don't hardly find any gospel witness. That's what led to Open Range. I was on staff at Lee Summit at the time and just got to looking around my area. Where was there not noticeable gospel witness? And there was a 4-county area surrounding Lee Summit that's all rural that I couldn't find hardly any activity. So Frank and I just said, let's go. Let's go plant the gospel. We'd go to rodeos, horse show, biker events, you name it. Other guys came on the team, Tony, Joe, Tim, others, Mike, those of you here, Dave. We've got 7 or 8 of us here today. That we just took the gospel out there just to see what happened. It was a grand experiment. Why don't we do more of that? Where we just experiment. I know we do. That's alive and well in this movement of churches. But I think we could kick it up a notch in terms of experimentation. And part of that just comes from owning the lostness around us. And just saying, this is a hill I'm going to die on. Jesus, help me. Join you in what you're doing. And see what happens with that. And so in gospel conversations, gospel saturation, conversations around the city with pastors, I've come to, through experience, sort of a network minimum. You know, we talked about a little bit about an ecclesial minimum. And when you talk, then networking is the trend. I mean, that's what's happening, guys. There's networks that are developing. I think Jesus has his hand on it. And so we've got to figure out what that means. And so in my case, through experience, I came up with what I said is a gospel saturation network DNA. What's the bare minimum it's going to take for us to see movement happen? And the Sending Project, which I'm a part of, it's a group in Kansas City, that we actually do collaborative projects. I was just talking to the Great Commission Europe guys this morning over breakfast about some things we can do in the Heartland region, and through the gospel saturation network of the Sending Project to actually collaborate to help Great Commission Europe. And if that works, we'll talk to Asia. We'll talk to Latin America. We'll see in Kansas City right now we've got 15 churches that are collaborating on international missions projects. 4 or 5 of them in India that have together planted 500 churches through what they've resourced and what they've sent over to do equipping in a 4-year period. 500 churches. Now, movement's happening there, and so some of that's piggybacking on what is already going on. But it's kind of exciting to think about uniting across denominational lines, networking together. What does it look like? And so it starts with disciple making. I mean, if we're going to be commissional, we got to make disciples, bottom line. And so that's the D, commissional, Matthew 28. Networking, a passage that I am just obsessed with and have been for now maybe a year and a half or 2. Acts 19. You know, I was just searching the scriptures. A lot of Acts is, descriptive. I wouldn't say it's prescriptive like some of the epistles, which prescribes certain ways of doing church. A lot of things are descriptive here, but they're very inspirational, very helpful in us looking at the New Testament for inspiration on what would church look like, right? And so that's what we're about. And I landed on this passage about a year and a half ago, and I'm just obsessed with it. I think about it all the time. Acts 19, verse 8. And this is Paul. You know what really got my attention was I was studying through the missionary journeys of Paul. And when he gets to Ephesus, he makes some drastic changes in his strategy. He quits traveling, is one thing. He was in Ephesus about 3 years total. This particular passage talks about 2 years of it. And so that got my attention. And I began to say, okay, Paul, what is he doing? Verse 8, he entered the synagogues. That was his practice. So he'd reach out to those who were already religious. He continued to speak out boldly for 3 months, reasoning and persuading them about the kingdom. Okay, so here's a little hint. Kingdom. He leads with that. So I started doing that. And then verse 9. But when some were becoming hardened and disobedient, speaking evil of the way before the multitude, he withdrew from them and took away the disciples. So he's got some kingdom disciples, and he gets run out of the synagogue. And so he takes those guys and gals and moves to the halls of Tyrannus, the hall of Tyrannus. And he just reasons there daily. And here's the verse that really got my attention. You guys know it. And this took place for 2 years, so that all who lived in Asia heard the word of the Lord, both Jews and Greeks. Wow. That's stunning, isn't it? In 2 years, everybody in the province, of course it's the Roman province, it's not all of Asia, we know of Asia today, but a huge span of territory. Now and so I began to pour into this and meditate, and here's the interesting thing. Did Paul start the mega church of Ephesus and everybody in the province of Asia came there? Is that how they heard the word of the Lord? No. You couldn't find a building big enough, it didn't exist and wouldn't. So his strategy was not centralization. He was decentralized, making disciples in such a way, sending to reach. He couldn't have gone himself and reached the entire province of Asia. So that was very instructive. And so that's the co-missional part. We've got a network. It's going to take all of us to get the job done. I really didn't like to learn this lesson, I must admit. I didn't, if you want to know the truth, I didn't want to unite with everybody in Kansas City. It's hard work. It creates more problems. But when you do really think about reaching every man, woman, and child in a metropolitan area in Kansas City, 2.3 million, we ain't going to get the job done by ourselves. And so you got to think differently. And so that was an operating conviction that I just had to embrace. Okay, going to have to unite with some other churches if we're going to get this done. And so that led to some networking. And then lastly, this is key, apostolic. This is the missional part. John 20. Jesus said, the Father has sent me, so I am sending you and me. The Father sent the Son. The Father and the Son sent the Holy Spirit. The Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit are sending us. A lot of sending going on there. So there's this ethos. There's this theology of sending that gives us the why behind missional. I just prefer using the New Testament word, apostolic, apostello. And so those three things. I told myself, if a church will commit to disciple making and networking like in Acts 19, and in being truly missional, apostolic, I'll work with that. And so I've learned that it starts with awareness. You work at it. You get out. I've created this strategy of tables, tracks, and tools, and then I'm building teams beyond that. So tables are just getting around over coffee, having conversations like the Great Commission person I mentioned earlier, just over coffee, over napkins, starting to talk about paradigm shifts. Those are the tracks that we talk about. Great Commission tracks. What does it take to get the job done? And then we've developed some tools too. And so part of this effort with this 47 churches, we just did it. We actually gave them, we did a simple prayer, care, share strategy. We called it, What If the Church Loves Kansas City? And we've got a website. I can give you all the resources if you want to do it too. And so we would hand this 3-week series to a church and say, you might even want to share pulpits, and many did. It was quite amazing. And it led to a lot of people adopting their neighborhoods missionally. So if churches are willing to think in that kind of way, I make them the priority. I had a discussion with our spring regional with the guys in the Heartland region. We were talking about some of these things, talking about some of our own brutal realities about some of our churches that have been around a while, and we need to stoke the fire. We've got to get the eye of the tiger back. And I found this is the case with a lot of pastors I sit down over a table with. They're in some kind of a cave of Adullam situation. They're in a victim kind of mentality. And at some point you're having these conversations with a pastor, and I'm like, they're telling their sob story about some of them are from big churches. I've become friends with about all the mega churches in our town. Was sitting down with one of them, 4,000 people, was telling me, honestly, he wouldn't say this in his own staff setting, he said, but now he is, but at the time he said, I wouldn't even tell my own staff this, but he says, I am concerned about the consumeristic culture. Got all these people coming. They're just consuming. He understood their programmatic approach to disciple making was not working, and was willing to be honest about it in a booth where nobody else could hear it. And so you get to a point, though, you hear these sob stories like, can we just stop talking about the sob story and say, what are we proactively going to do about it? Just like I did with that individual earlier, at some point you got to say, what would it look like if we did something differently? And would you do it? Let's start getting functional, you know what I'm saying? And so these are the kind of conversations that happen. But a lot of them start with dealing with disappointment. We're kind of managing disappointment when it comes to the Great Commission. And this is even the bigger churches. And I was reminded of a passage, 2 Timothy 3:5, which talks about a form of religion, but denying its power. I learned a principle back, this is several decades ago. I was the exec pastor with Doug and Tim there at Lee's Community Church. And, as church was growing, we went for years and years, growth, every year, growth. a lot of positive things. We tried to really do disciple making, but a lot of it really was transfer growth too. You know, you live by transfer growth, you eventually die by it. So that's one of the sad realities. But we came to this place where we were beginning to do the natural church development surveys. Remember that? And it would tell you your strengths in the church and your weakness. Very helpful. I still recommend it to this day, those kind of assessing situations. But a principle, I'll just give a shout out to Jeff Kern. He taught me this principle of, some of you remember Jeff, organized abandonment. Anybody remember that principle? I think it has a scriptural basis. I'd rather say reckless abandonment. This one mega church, to finish that story, he actually, about 4,000 people in his church, he asked me if I would teach their leadership development on what it means to be missional. They had this leader development curriculum. I got to ask him about it. Well, most of it was organizational leadership. And in many ways, I said, hey, I'm going to share some things going to push back on that. Now, you're still willing to do it, but I haven't accepted because I think you got to get to the right thinking. I mean, if you're just going to come in and start to try to blow stuff up, I don't know. I'm not really into that. But I think in terms of our situation in the Heartland, we're managing disappointment a little bit in terms of the Great Commission. But I think if we get back to organized abandonment, where we acknowledge the power, I think we'll begin to see some movement speeding up again, some reckless abandon. And we began to talk about, okay, what are we measuring? You know, we all do the annual survey for Great Commission churches. It's helpful. Tells us some things. No problem there. But most of it's counting. So we began to talk, what is the difference between counting and measuring? Boy, I am running out of time here. I'm going to have to skip through some things here. Basically, measuring is more looking at outputs, getting beyond, buildings, maintain, and butts and seats, and even big shots on the stage. We've got to think a little differently. And so some of what we talked about, again, was lowering the bar of ecclesiology. What does that look like? Raising the bar of disciple making, and understanding that our fruit grows on other people's trees. Remember who said that originally? Bob Buford. He just passed away. His funeral was last week. Very influential in the whole leadership network. Cool statement. Let me just say this. In terms of thinking more archetype, I was reminded this week of the Velvet Underground. Anybody remember that band? I mean, if you do, you're kind of old and you're cool at the same time. The Velvet Underground. It was an Andy Warhol. He produced this album, their first album. This record producer said the first Velvet Underground album only sold 10,000 copies, but everybody bought it, formed a band. It was very influential. I mean, they really weren't that good, in my opinion. I didn't really care for the music. I listened to it some back then. But I mean, another example for me, I listened to the Ramones some. Remember the Ramones? Well, they really weren't that good. I mean, I think they knew 3 chords and they had volume. And but what people saw with them is they said, hey, I can do that. I can start a rock band. And many did. And I think getting back to ecclesial minimum thinking helps us see, that's one of the things we discover in the larger churches. They don't plant a lot of churches because nobody thinks they can do what they're a part of. And so we got to think more archetype, I think. Let me ask this question. If I could promise you, it used to be back in the church growth movement, I don't know if it's still statistically a megachurch is 2,000 people. Is that still how we define a megachurch? If I could promise you 2,000 people added to your church next week that would be in attendance, but only 200 of them would live on mission. I mean, hardcore Great Commission disciples. Or, I gave you the choice, you could have 2,000 missionaries that really lived it, but you could only get 200 of them to come to anything. Which one would you pick? We know the right answer, but I think you got to look deep on that one. Because the first scenario, the 2,000 coming, that validates us. Big auditorium like this, that's validation. That's heady stuff. Coming week after week to hear you preach. Would you trade that 2,000 for just 200 coming, But you had another 2,000 that were out there living on mission. I think we ought to start a new breaking the 200 barrier. And that'd be it right there. 200 barrier looks like 200 coming and 2,000 on mission. Anybody want to start that with me? We'll get that going. They still do 200 barrier seminars today. Anybody go to those? Been around a while. I began to think about permission giving. It's interesting. You sat across from I've sat across from so many guys in Kansas City, sharp guys in churches, where they've gone to them and said, "Hey, I want to do some missional kind of things. And they've been told across the desk by the senior guy, no. So I looked up the etymology of the word permission. I think it's a little bit scandalous, really, to think that we can not give somebody. I mean, who are we? Jesus is head of the church, right? And so I sat across from these guys, and they've been told no. Well, I tell them yes. Like they need me to. They don't. But some guys are just looking for somebody that has some kind of authority position to affirm them and say, you can do it. Eye of the tiger. Go for it. And it reminded me of Acts 13, where Paul and Barnabas were sent out. It said that some prophets and teachers, they were fasting and praying. The Lord said, set apart for me Paul and Barnabas. You know the story. I find it fascinating, though. It says that the prophets and teachers, said of the leaders there, it says that they sent them out in verse 3. And then it says in the next verse 4, it says the Holy Spirit sent them. Well, which one was doing the sending? Well, they're two different Greek words. The first one is really more sending as in let them go, releasing them. The other one is a stronger word for send, having been sent forth. That's the one used of the Holy Spirit. So the Holy Spirit sends, we release. Right? And so I don't blame a pastor for sitting across somebody at their desk and truly assessing, maybe there's a character issue. Maybe there's something like that. But we ought to be affirming of ones that want to get out there on the front lines, like what we're used to, what we grew up with in this association of churches. Oh gosh, I'm going to have to speed ahead here. First of all, I think part of our problem is with the Great Commission. I think we've made Matthew 28 an evangelism text. I'll find out tonight if Robbie affirms this. I would say it's a discipleism text. Now, evangelism is part of that, but it's helpful for us to think more in terms of pre-conversion and post-conversion discipleship. Have you ever thought in terms of pre-convert disciple? That's part of our training in this little micro-church. We're training guys to think that way. You got somebody that's embracing following Christ. Maybe they haven't converted yet. It'll happen. Isn't that the way Jesus did it? He walked up to some guys early on in the Gospels and said, follow me. I'll make you to become fishers of men. It's interesting, later on, after 3 years, he said, now you go and make. The first one was he said, I'll make you to become. Later he says, now you go make. And I think we can think the same way. And then we're beginning to think less about having preaching centers and more about disciple-making communities. Because we're perfectly designed to achieve what we're currently achieving. And if we're not achieving disciple-making, sometimes we got to admit we're perfectly designed to achieve non-disciple-making. And that's a good place to be in. That's back to the drawing board. God help with that. In my environment, I want to see more disciple-making. And so I think that's a healthy thing. Jesus has all the authority, right? It says that in Matthew 28. All authority in heaven and earth is given to him. And he wants things done his way, and that way is making disciples. Now, you may have a better way, but you don't have a heaven and earth, right? This is a graph of a Barna survey. Quite frankly, it came out some months ago. It was part of why I shaved my head. It's kind of a metaphor for I'm just doing away with subtlety. I'm picking a fight with not embracing the Great Commission. That's my way of pushing into darkness. Barna asked this question. This is an evangelical survey. It just came out a few months ago. I'd recommend you reading it. Barna asked churchgoers, these are all people that go to church, have you heard of the Great Commission? 51% hadn't even heard of it. Now, that's bad enough, but it gets worse. Another quarter of them, 25%, kind of think they recall the term, couldn't tell you what it meant. 6%, I'm not sure. Only 17% said they've heard of it, and kind of maybe can describe what it is. It gets worse in the survey with young people, millennials, Gen Y. 10% even have heard the term and can give some kind of guess at what it means. I'm picking a fight with that. Anybody with me? I'm done with that. That's ridiculous. That's American churchianity. We call ourselves Great Commission churches. Why don't we be the ones to show the way to our evangelical brethren? I've almost got to a place where I don't even want to call myself Christian. You know, there's surveys about people that call themselves Christian. I'm like, I wish less would. Let me end with this. 1 Samuel 22. I promised to do that. I'm over time. If you'll give me a couple of minutes. Is that all right, John? 2 minutes? 3? 1 Samuel 22. This is a passage that actually came to mind. I woke up in the middle of the night a couple of weeks ago praying for Mark Darling. And we email back and forth occasionally. I didn't want to have any more involvement, just to encourage him occasionally. And this passage came to mind. I sent it to him, and if I read to you what he replied with, it'd bring some tears. But in 1 Samuel 22, this is getting back to the drawing board. God sovereignly allows these things, I think, to reshape us if we'll let Him. We'll be better, not bitter. And in this case, 1 Samuel 22 talks about the cave of Adullam. So David departed there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and his father's household heard of it, they went down to be there. And it says, everyone who is distressed and in debt and discontented, in the context is with Saul. You know the story. David was already famous. He had already killed Goliath and all that. And that's actually what kind of ticked off Saul, wanted to kill him. David's running. He's escaping. Escaped to the cave of Adullam. And these guys banded around him. About as many as we've got coming to this conference. I don't know what's the attendance, about 400. There's 400 people, it says, 400 men who came around him and to make him captain over them. They gathered around him. This is rich with meaning. I wish I had time to unpack this, maybe another time. But if you thought, first of all, okay, how does this apply to me as the leader of a church? No, that's organizational thinking. This is a picture, David is a picture of Jesus. And the men that gathered around him made him central. They wanted to make him king. That was their mission. It was kingdom. David's in the cave. 400 men gather around him, make him captain over them. And so it's not so much about new structures, but a new center. And they were saying, we are going to make David king. It's more about the Lord of the house over the house of the Lord. And so these men got that. Verse 3. David puts his family in a safe place until he could figure out what God was doing. Let's drop down to verse 5. And then the prophet Gad comes along and says, all right, David, don't stay in this stronghold, or it's referring to the cave. Depart and go. And I think this is a picture of how things are with church. We in a cavalier way, we talk about planting churches. Really, we plant the gospel. God does His church thing as a result. It's more about letting Him birth it. And out of this cave was birthed a kingdom mission. And 400 men, mighty men, came to help make David king. That's a picture of Jesus. And that just... So if we're in a cave, if you're not, you're going to be there eventually. Think in those terms. What would you do if the prophet would come to you? What stronghold are you facing right now? And the prophet's coming to you and saying, hey, it's time to leave the stronghold. Put that behind you. Leave the cave. Get going. And what would we think of if we were to think beyond our old wineskins that some of us have developed? And there's good stuff in old wineskins. Old wine is of high value. But new wine, I think God, go ahead and get set up, Frank, to close us off with the song. If we were to think beyond old wineskins and professional kind of expectations that come with doing church today, and just for the love of it, just getting back to an amateur. You know what an amateur is? They don't do it for pay. They do it out of love. We need to get back to kind of amateur thinking in terms of the Great Commission. What would that look like? We need to think about God using us to bring about new wine. What would you do if Jesus and His kingdom, what would you do for Jesus and His kingdom if there were no compromise or no lack of courage in you? Thinking beyond salaries, beyond paychecks, anything, status, people coming to hear you preach, how validating that is. Get beyond all that. Think in terms of bringing the gospel to speak into that. What would it look like? Brave obedience or playing it safe? We can't do both. This song that Frank's going to do speaks of language about being crushed like grapes, in the crushing, in the pressing. It's a new song some of you may have heard. It's out of those times of pressing and crushing that God brings new wine. And are we willing to be that kind of vessel before God? Will you pray with me? Lord, we would ask that you would make us your vessel. We are your vessel. We acknowledge that. We offer ourselves to you. Beyond the professionalism, we want to come to you as your Great Commission amateurs, just out of love for pressing into darkness and saying, we're going to pick a fight with that. We're going to pick a fight with the darkness and own the lostness and bring the Great Commission. Plant the gospel. Lord, make us that. And if you need to press us and crush us to get there, we welcome that, Lord, because we know that in new wine there's new power and freedom. And that's where your kingdom is. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.